Hey, it's Rich, and today we're going to be talking about installing a roof rack system on my 2021 Chevrolet Colorado ZR2 Bison. Now, this will apply to just about any of the mid-size trucks and even some of the full-size trucks that you're going to be applying a roof rack to. And the traditional methodology of attaching a roof rack is removing that seam that covers up where the outside edge, the top, the inner structure, and the inner roof structure all weld together. And if you've seen this done before, or if you've done it yourself, you know this is something that just eats up drill bits. But you've also seen, for those people that go out and really use their vehicles, you might run into issues where you might have potential leakage. All of that is a result of that uneven surface, drilling through them, and sometimes opening up the holes too big for those rivnuts to fill up. And that leads to possible water intrusion and eventually the loosening up of the rack. So today I actually have a different solution, and this is using a Yakima roof track. And I was introduced to this by Sam over at Overland Ruff Racks and his roof rack system, which has a new way of installing. And that's what we're going to show you today and go over what the benefits are. Before I jump into showing the installation, I do want to go over what a roof track is. And it's basically an extrusion made out of aluminum, and it has a couple of parts to it. There's going to be some holes. We got to put those rivnuts in to mount. And believe it or not, this aluminum does have some flex to it, so it will curve to the top of the vehicle. But more importantly, this is a system that allows for a variable movement here. You basically have a slide that goes in with a pin and a bolt, and then allows you to mount whatever you're doing for accessories on the top. Additionally, it has this little plate underneath, and this is a flexible nylon, plastic, or something of that nature, which just insulates that metal, so when there's any vibration or whatnot, it's not going to cause some damage to the paint. Ultimately, this is going to be a useful tool in our installation, and we'll go over that right now. Besides the roof tracks, we have a few things in the box. You're going to find silicone rubber cement. You're going to have plus nuts. These are basically a style of riv nut here that we're going to use to compress in the body. We have our hardware kit, so they give us all of the pieces you'll need to pre-drill, as well as everything to lock it in place, and a guide for using that. But we're going to go ahead and use a more advanced tool for putting in the plus nut, and then of course our finishing caps there. The first thing we're going to have to do the roof track is cut it down in size. Now, you can buy these in a multitude of different sizes. I believe Yakima makes them in 3, but based on your application, you're going to have to cut this down to work on your vehicle. In this case, I am using the Overland Ruff Racks, and in the instructions for this particular setup on the Colorado, it does require I remove one of those segments at the very end. Something to make note of here is that you see my tape line does only come after that bolt hole. We want to make sure that there's a bolt hole on either end to make sure that the roof track holds down against the surface of the roof. Now, if you do need to cut it to a custom length where the holes that are already provided aren't there, just make sure you drill a hole and leave the appropriate space so you can still put the cap at the end and make sure that the end of the roof track doesn't come up. This is something we have to repeat for both sides, so as you can see here, I am transferring my cut line with the piece of tape and repeating that process over again. We want to make sure that they're as close as possible, but ultimately at the end, if you don't have them exactly the same, it's not going to be too much of an issue because the mounting points do slide inside the extrusion track. Now we have to move to the roof of the vehicle, and we're going to start the layout process using that flexible strip that goes underneath the roof track as our guideline. And the big thing to notice here is that you're going to see that the roof, while it seems like it's got parallel lines, doesn't, and that's because there's a curve from left to right as well as from front to back. So now I'm going to lay out the exact measurements to mount the Overland Ruff Racks roof rack on the Chevrolet Colorado. As you can see here, we have some measurements that I've laid out, and in the instruction book for most of the roof tracks out there, they're going to say to use the back of the cab. However, with the Colorado, there's so much curvature there, the best point of measure is the front. And here I've identified the front bolt hole locations, and as indicated by A1, the distance from the top of the windshield is 8 inches. A equals 39.5 inches, which is the distance from the mounting points on the roof rack to the roof track. So this distance has to remain the same from the front of the vehicle to the back of the vehicle, and that's represented by the A measurement on both the front and the back of the roof track. Here you can see that 1.5 inches distance from the centerline hole on the roof track to the edge of that black trim is wider in the front than it is in the back. In the back here, you're going to look at about 1 inch, but the important part to realize is the center line of the bolts, measured from any part from the left side of the vehicle to the right side of the vehicle, is going to remain 39.5 inches. With everything squared up, we're ready to mark the holes, and we're only going to use every other hole. In this case, we are fortunate with the Colorado that we have an odd number of holes, which means when we go every other one, we get the very first one and the very last one and an even spacing throughout. If for some reason you are doing a custom application and you do run into not having a hole that lines up, just make sure you don't skip any more than one at a time. Otherwise, you don't get even distribution of that load, and potentially you might have an issue with a failure because there's too much movement. Here, every other one is more than sufficient, but if you really want to, you can drill more holes and put every hole in there. I just don't see the practicality, and as well, the instructions state that it's not necessary. We're now ready to remove our guide and expose the holes we've just traced, and we're going to want to use a center punch here to make sure that the drill doesn't walk. In this case, we are working with some very tight tolerances, so you want to make sure that we do use that pilot drill and also use a center punch to mark that hole. Here you can see we're using a small pilot bit here to start the hole. Again, that bigger bit that we're going to use to get that plus nut in there is going to be one where if it walks, it may move that hole to a point where it's not usable. So pilot hole, use a drill stop, make sure that we don't puncture anything down below. Get rid of any of the material that comes out. You can either vacuum or blow that away. And then we're going to make sure we step up to the proper bit size here. And I'm even going to use a tighter tolerance, a little closer to 3/16 on the bigger drill bit for the drill stop. And again, just make sure that we don't put too much pressure. We don't want to dent the surface of the roof. And we also want to make sure that we clean up any burrs here. Any burrs left behind will make it more difficult for the plus nut to set inside. So just going to use a light countersink here to make sure that we don't make the hole any bigger. And more importantly, we don't want to make it too big so that the plus nut doesn't have a nice snug fit. Here we're going to do a test fit, and as you can see, the plus nut fits into the hole with just a little bit of force, which is just right for what we're trying to do here. We want to repeat the same drilling process, use a pilot hole, then the finished hole, use your drill stop so we don't put an extra hole in our headliner, and ultimately this step is critical to making sure that our plus nuts have a good expansion when we pull them tight against the body. So spend your time removing all the burrs so we get a nice good contact point and that plus nut is completely expanded underneath. If you remember at the beginning, I showed you that the kit does come with its own rubber silicone sealant. I've had really good luck with this Loctite product. It is a marine adhesive and sealant. I tend to find that it seals the area off a little better. It also remains flexible longer, and because it is a marine application, it is more UV resistant and as well does good underwater as much as it does just being exposed to water. The biggest thing you're going to see here in my application is making sure that we get some around the top where the plus nut sits, as well as into the hole, covering all of those exposed areas where we've done the cutting. Once we have that plus nut into the tool, we're going to fit that in, and as you can see, I made sure that the drill size was going to be just sufficient enough to make sure we had a really tight fit. And we're going to go ahead and expand that riv nut with the tool. Now we need to repeat that same process for each of the holes we've created. We want to make sure we put a little bit of that adhesive sealant in there and then place the plus nut or riv nut through that, expand it, and then what you're going to see at the end here I'm going to go back and place a little bit more of that same adhesive sealant on the edges and expanding about 1/4 of an inch around. This just makes sure that there's enough material to bond to the upper part of the body panel and give the opportunity for the plus nut or riv nut, whichever you're using, to expand and move and not leave a place for water to intrude. Giving this about 30 to 45 minutes to dry, we're going to move on to the next step here, which you can see I've already slid in that insulator that goes between the roof track and the top of the cab. We're going to now put all of our parts that we need to slide into the track. These will be our roof rack mounts. We'll get those slid into place in the track, and we're going to get ready to put all of our end caps on and get the hardware through for its final installation. Now we have the plastic cap that goes on the front and the back. This will lock in everything in between. As you can see, this slides into the groove and there's a bolt that passes through. Now that we have all the hardware inside the track, we can start prepping the surface for sealing. I'm using a Loctite clear silicone. You can use the provided rubber silicone sealant, but I like the Loctite products a little bit better. Take a little bit of time here. You want to make sure that you put enough into each of the holes to make sure that when you pass the bolt through, it's completely sealed. Now we're going to put that same silicone sealant on the back side of the bolt. This will make sure that there's a good amount of material that gets pushed through the hole to make sure that the head completely seals. This is one of the reasons why we're using a clear silicone sealant, because some of this will protrude. It might come to the edge. The whole idea here is it fills in all the nooks and crannies so that when the bolt is in, there's no possible way for it to leak. We want to make sure that we suspend the roof track with all the silicone that we've placed over the holes just above everything and not pushing into any of the holes just yet. We want to make sure that the front is the first part we get started. We do have to take in consideration that there is a curvature to the roof, and as such, we're going to start the front, then start the second one, and move our way to the third. And here, we're just making sure that all of our holes are lined up to the bolt heads. Once we get to the back, we want to make sure everything is just lightly installed, and then we're going to work our way from the front to the back and through the middle here, just making sure that each of these is snug. We want to make sure that we're not using any power tools at this point. We don't want to pull the riv nuts through. We have a lot of the silicone still taking its final set. So this is just about making sure that we get that nice even curvature of the roof matched up. And as you can see, when everything's installed, everything slides down the track nice and easy. So here's a final view of what it looks like from the top with both roof tracks installed. Again, you're going to see that variance from the front having a different gap to the back. And what you're going to see in the following pictures is that none of that's going to be seen from ground level. And the way that most roof racks will utilize this, and specifically the Overland Ruff Racks cab rack, you're not going to see that gap or that differential once that roof rack is mounted on top. The best part about this, though, is I didn't have to go through the frustration of a traditional roof rack mount that goes through all that drilling. This is going to provide me a solid, worry-free ownership and something that I think will endure all the abuse that I put my truck through. Thank you for tuning in to the channel and, of course, watching this video all the way through. If you can like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell, all that helps me help you have better content to watch on my channel. Thanks again.